great to have you all with us here for the 2021 Constitution Day conversation with scholar and education practitioner Ian Rowe. I know for our students, you all realize that the School of Public Policy takes Constitution Day very seriously because we take the Constitution seriously. It is certainly a grounding of our Roots of American Order core class here. But we teach it not just as a history course, not just as a constitutional law course, but we teach it in a way that understands that the Constitution grew out of deliberation and debate. It grew out of a time of great polarization in this country. I think if there's something that civics education today, to the degree it even deals with the Constitution, is lacking, is that it teaches the Constitution as if it were some monolithic effort, something that came out of some stone tablets that were dropped on Mount Sinai just outside of Philadelphia, and out of a movement of everybody like-minded coming together, we now have the Constitution. But as our students know, the Constitution was really fraught with argumentation and debate. There were many times throughout the convention and throughout the succeeding years in which the Constitution was debated around the country, where many wondered whether the Constitution would even survive. We read and study the Federalist Papers, which are an important part of the story of the Constitution and showed in many ways, just in their development, that our founders understood that it was really going to have to be through persuasion, through civil discussion and debate, that the Constitution could be created. In Federalist No. 1, Alexander Hamilton, for whom it is said, just as a window into how fractious the debates were at the time of the writing of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton said, and I quote, "No man's ideas were more remote from the plan than mine were known to be." Even Hamilton thought that there was too much compromise happening in the final document. James Madison said the same thing. But in arguing for that same Constitution, Hamilton, one of the significant writers of the Federalist Papers, framed the debate in this way. This is from Federalist 1. That the debate is really between an over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people, which is more commonly the fault of the head than of the heart, will be represented as mere pretense and artifice, the stale bait for popularity at the expense of the public good. It will be forgotten on the one hand that jealousy is the usual concomitant of violent love, and that the noble enthusiasm of liberty is too apt to be infected with a spirit of narrow and illiberal distrust. On the other hand, it will be the trial to the security of liberty, that in the contemplation of a sound and well-informed judgment, their interests can never be separated, and that a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidding appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. So we teach the Constitution here not just as a document, but as a way of working together to solve public policy problems. That's why we not only teach it, but we also celebrate it. And celebrate it we do today. I'm so honored to be joined by my friend Ian Rowe, who really has become a national leader, not only in education policy, but in taking these principles around civics education and bringing them directly into our K-12 classrooms, often in environments that one would not normally find them. Ian is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education policy and social capital formation. He is the co-founder of Vertex Partnerships Academies, which is a network of baccalaureate high schools in the Bronx. He serves as a visiting fellow at the Woodson Center and is a writer for the 1776 Unites movement, something I look forward to speaking with him about this afternoon. Until last year, Rowe was the CEO of Public Prep, a network of public charter schools based in the South Bronx and Lower East Side portion of Manhattan. Please join me in welcoming Ian Rowe to Pepperdine. Ian, great to see you.
Pete, it is such a pleasure and such an honor to be here and to be here at Pepperdine. It is absolutely gorgeous.
So let's begin just with before we get into some of the work you're doing and some of the discussion around the importance of Constitution Day and the Constitution itself, to tell us a little bit of your background. I explained some of it here before. You have a Harvard MBA, you have a business background, but I think it would be helpful for our students here who are thinking about careers not only in the government, but also in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector. You're one who has worked across the sectors. How did you come out of Harvard with your MBA and develop this passion for education?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, thank you. And before I even get there, I think it's really wonderful that you are commemorating Constitution Day. Unfortunately, I don't think this activity is happening across the country. But the Constitution is extremely relevant. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, 2 incidents, I could name many, but just last week, regardless of whether or not you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, the President of the United States made a statement that every private corporation in the country with employees above 100 must do this thing, which is, force their employees to do a certain action. Does he have the power to do that? Again, regardless of whether or not you agree with the principle or the idea, that's a fundamental question, because if he does, what other powers does the president unilaterally just have the power to do? And I think a deeper understanding of the Constitution, what powers it affords to the government and what powers it affords to the people, that kind of pronouncement, I think, should be discussed more broadly. And then second, again, a few weeks ago, we all saw these searing images from Afghanistan. This crush of humanity, of all of these people trying to leave Afghanistan, partly because they knew what they were escaping in terms of the terror of the Taliban. But imagine what you must feel, or what that you are seeking to achieve, by literally jumping onto an airplane that is lifting off, that you desire so much. And I think there was a desire to come to the United States of America. Like, what does that represent? What is it about this country, flaws and all, that the Constitution and its amendments created a sense of opportunity and hope and the ability to have your own opportunity uplift your own life, that you would literally be willing to jump on a plane that is lifting off? So again, thank you for doing this commemoration, because I think we have to remind ourselves every year what the Constitution and its amendments have created in this country, warts and all. In terms of my own personal background, I did go to, the pedigree of Harvard and Cornell and all that, but, for most of us, most of our life lessons were built when we were very, very young. So my parents came to this country from Jamaica, West Indies in the mid-1960s during a time of great racial tumult. When we talk about systemic racism, that's literally when racism was enshrined into law. We needed the Civil Rights Act. We needed several parts of legislation. So my parents were very cognizant of what was going on in this country, being black, and what that meant. But they also knew that the country was changing and that opportunities were being created. And the key was that we were prepared, even knowing that we would face racial discrimination and other forms of challenges. They'd seen how other people had come to the United States and succeeded: black people, white people, Irish people, Catholic, a whole host of folks who have been marginalized in some way. And yet the embrace of the founding principles that are embedded in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that's what they saw. The power of faith and family, hard work, free enterprise, entrepreneurship. Those were the things that they said could get us through, even in the face of discrimination. And I'll just end with one story. We first moved to Brooklyn Anyone here's from New York. And then we moved on up to Queens. And we moved to a small town called Laurelton, New York. Lovely little town. And Laurelton had been a predominantly Jewish and Italian, predominantly white neighborhood, but it was slowly racially mixing, and there was racial tension. And I went to junior high school 231, which was, the first year was, very racially mixed, but there were a number of incidents occurring. And so the school board decided to make a decision to open and annex another junior high school in Rosedale, the town right next to Laurelton, which was predominantly and more permanently white. And so all of the parents all of the white parents in my junior high school decided to take their kids out of our school and move them to the annex in Rosedale, right? Making junior high school 231 essentially an all-black school. And my parents, my Jamaican immigrant parents, on the assumption that where the white kids go, that's where the better education would be, wanted to send me to this other school. And I will always remember this Sunday night. It was the night before we had to essentially put in the transfer papers. And I bet, my dad was in his recliner, it's like Archie Bunker in his chair. My mom was on the couch, like they were in their normal positions. And I remember begging my parents, please don't transfer me. I love my school. I love my teachers. Why is it that the education is necessarily going to be better in this other school just because that's where most of the white kids will be? And I pleaded. I had never questioned my parents about anything. They'd been married for 48 years before my dad passed away, and like they would crawl through broken glass if they thought that would be better for me. Mm-hmm. And I begged them, I please do not do this to me. And they ultimately relented, And it was the first time I've ever felt, the sense of agency that I could control my destiny. But deeper, I didn't know it then, but I think it's informed all of my career that just because something is quote unquote all black doesn't mean it's all bad, right? Because we've got the power. We actually live in a country where there are principles that can allow you to move forward that transcend your race or transcend your current condition. And so that was really powerful. And when I think about Constitution Day, I think about things like that. Because those documents represent the principles that allow us all to be able to move forward.
So again, you had a very early experience with the importance of education policy and education decisions. Coming out of graduate business school, where was the transition then to even an interest in education policy? That wouldn't seem to be a natural fit.
Yeah, I'm weird in that way. I've just had a very strange career. I stayed in kindergarten through 12, so I'm a New York City public school kid. Had a great tuition-free education. I went to Brooklyn Tech, one of the specialized high schools in New York City. If you're familiar with those, there's a lot of controversy because there's some people, you have to take a test to get into the school, and there's some people who want to eliminate those tests because there isn't enough of a representative makeup. So as opposed to improving the education of kids kindergarten through 8th grade to increase the chances that more kids of all races can get into these great specialized high schools, the mayor and others, they just want to eliminate the test. I don't think that's going to solve the problem, right? It'll create some artificial virtue signaling accounting solution where you have a different racial makeup, but you haven't done anything to fundamentally address the issue, right? So I went to Brooklyn Tech. I took the test. And it's actually really interesting. There were a lot of black kids and Asian kids and Latin kids when I went to Brooklyn Tech, and I think some of the policies over the course of the last years have diminished the quality of education, kindergarten through 8th grade. So that was one of my experiences. Again, I didn't even know anything about policy, but when I look back, these things were really important. When I was in elementary school, there was something called Intellectually Gifted and SP Special Progress. There were all these programs for gifted kids. We didn't have charter schools, but my parents did exercise school choice, right? They decided to keep me in the school that I wanted to stay in, and we were all more invested in being successful. So when I then graduated from high school, I went to Cornell and majored in computer science engineering, and I started on the traditional track working for a management consulting firm. In 6 years, I could have become a partner and all that, but I was also mentoring in public schools during that time. And there, for the grace of God, will go I. I mean, there were lots of really talented kids that I was mentoring, tons of, and they, just by accident of the zip code that they were born into or the family structure, they didn't have the same opportunity. And I just thought that was unfair. So at the end of 6 years, I was like, what should I do? And long story, I had the opportunity to go to Harvard Business School. I went to Harvard. I started writing for the school newspaper, started writing about issues of importance. I met this woman, Wendy Kopp, who was founding Teach for America at the time. And I was just taken by this vision that, gosh, really talented people can go into teaching or go into education. That's novel. And at Harvard Business School, none of my classmates were thought that way. So I decided to do a speech about pursuing your passion at Harvard Business School in my first year to convince my classmates that maybe instead of Goldman Sachs and BCG and McKinsey and blah, 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 why not go into teaching? And I did this speech, and of course, none of my classmates decided to go into teaching. But I then became the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business School newspaper. And so I took the speech and made it an editorial that I published. And that editorial ultimately made its way to Wendy Kopp because I used Teach for America as an example of an organization for how someone who had a non-education background could enter the teaching profession. So I met Wendy, and then I crafted a summer job at Teach for America in between my first and second year of business school. And then I did the crazy thing. When I graduated from Harvard Business School, I went to work at Teach for America in its early days when we didn't know if we would be making payroll every 2 weeks, but it changed the course of my career.
Now, over the last couple years, you've been increasingly involved in civics education work. As I mentioned before in the intro, you've joined the Robert Woodson Center. Bob is actually an honorary degree recipient here from the Policy School and a longtime friend here of the Graduate Policy School. Also a part of a group called 1776 Unites, which has developed its own civics curriculum. So there are a lot of people involved in education policy that don't go on to have a particular interest in civics. What was it about what either you were seeing or the need that you were perceiving that you have made this next step of in your career to think not just about education policy, but also about civics education?
Yeah, so if you don't know Bob Woodson, please do research on him. He's a exceptional figure. For the last 40 years, he's led an organization called the Woodson Center. I think it was called the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise before, but he spent his entire life focused on how to, a lot of people, policymakers talk about all these people, poor and poverty, they talk about them all the time. Well, Bob has actually implemented policies and programs in communities where he empowers the people themselves to become agents of their own uplift. So rather than just shouting in the rain and whining and complaining, how do we actually do this? You're not just at a think tank, you're actually taking the ideas you're coming up in this beautiful academic setting and then going into the real world and actually putting them into practice. Actually interacting with the very people that you're talking about all the time, but never or rarely giving an opportunity to say, how do these programs actually impact us on a day-to-day life? So when I met with Bob Woodson, this was back in early 2020, the New York Times had just released the 1619 Project. And the New York Times, has everyone had a chance to read the New York Times 1619 Project? I'm curious. Oh, a few nodding heads. So that, when it first came out, was just a magazine issue, and it made some pretty bold claims, right? Eschew the Constitution. The real founding of the country was 1619, not 1776. The founding ideals were false when they were written. The country was founded as a slavocracy, not a democracy. anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of the country. These are all things that the New York Times 1619 Project said. And when I got together with Bob and a bunch of other amazing leaders like Glenn Lowry, who I know has also spoke at Pepperdine, it was clear that the New York Times wasn't just interested in a magazine issue. They wanted to capture the hearts and minds of the rising generation. So they said, let's partner with Random House to publish books that perpetuate the same ideology. Let's partner with the Pulitzer Center to create a K-12 curriculum. And then we saw that 3,500 teachers had accessed the curriculum, and we thought, wow, what do we do? Is it enough just to write essays and make speeches? And we were doing that.
Right.
But the great thing about someone like a Bob Woodson and the Woodson Center, and I hope someone that, like me, like, how do you put your ideas and your principles into action? How do you create a compelling alternative that someone can say yes to? Not just shout in the rain and complain and say this is wrong. You should do that. But also say, here's something else that meets our common objective but does it in a different way. So we said, rather than offer teachers a cherry-picked negative view, which is what we viewed the 1619 Project, because if you want to look back at American history and find lots of terrible, atrocious things that happened to black and other people, you can find them, and you can weave a pretty horrific narrative if that's the lens through which you want to look at our history. Or you can take a look at those same events. For example, the Tulsa Massacre, one of the units that we've created in the 1776 Unites curriculum is about the Tulsa Massacre. Well, it's also about the entrepreneurship and all the opportunities that led up to the wealth that was generated by the black community in the lead up to the Tulsa Massacre, as well as the rebuilding that occurred after the Tulsa Massacre. You got to tell the whole story, warts and all. The opportunities that existed, the terrible violence and murder that happened, as well as what happened afterwards. Every single part of the American story, that's what makes this country so unique. I mean, you know, it is, you know, we the people, you know, in order to form a more perfect union. It has not been perfect, obviously, but you cannot deny the progress. So 1776 Unites curriculum, we decided to create what will become a K-12 fully free curriculum. Right now it's only grades 9 through 12, and since we released it a few months ago, it's already been downloaded more than 20,000 times by teachers in all 50 states. Teachers in traditional district schools, charter schools, private schools, religious schools, after schools, home schools, prison ministries. And so the thing that's exciting about that is, rather than just getting into a tete-a-tete, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones, you're bad, or you're New York Times, you're bad, like we disagree, right? We just disagree that your interpretation of American history, which in a free country you have the power to do, and you also have the power to create a curriculum that espouses those. That's the beauty of the country. But it also means we have the power to do the same thing and tell a more complete story. And so that's what we've done. And I think that's how we have to think again about how the Constitution is relevant to today's world. We need a competition of ideas, right? We need the ability to be able to discuss these things. Go on, put up your theory, critical race theory. Let's debate it. Well, how does it actually play out in the lives of kids, right? And so that's what we decided to do with 1776 Unites. And I think the response to it has only affirmed for us how the founding principles can actually be a galvanizing force, not only to tell the story of African Americans in the United States, but how to use that story as an inspiration for people of all races for how you can face adversity and become agents of your own uplift.
So let's talk about the Constitution specifically. When you and I were talking about preparing for this discussion, you would use a phrase that's been proclaimed, made famous by Ibram Kendi, and actually you turned it on its side to say that it is your understanding of the Constitution itself is actually an anti-racist document. Now we understand how Kendi means it and how he has obviously sought to apply it in curricula, but how do you perceive the Constitution itself as an anti-racist document?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a difference between being anti-racist and against racism, right? And pro-human. And the Constitution, again, for all of its flaws, for all of its, that's why we needed amendments, but was written at a time where the world was ordered around inequality. That was the norm. That was the status quo. And it took a bold vision to create a document that started to lay out a very different set of ideas. A set of ideas that were focused on equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity. Wow. Those are concepts that, in my view, are much more inspiring. Again, where I ran schools in the heart of the South Bronx for the last 10 years, primarily low-income kids, primarily black and brown kids, parents were not clamoring for critical race theory or these ideas that says, you live in an oppressive nation and only if white people suddenly, turn their, racist agenda backwards, that's the only way you're going to succeed. That's not what our parents were asking for. Our parents were trying to understand, what are the strategies that you're going to help my kids understand for how they can be successful in this country, even in the face of discrimination? Doesn't mean that discrimination doesn't exist or obstacles in life won't exist, but the country and its founding documents affords a set of principles that, in my view, are more powerful than what Kendi and others are putting forth. But let them put it forth. Every now and then, it's actually, I think, sort of a good thing for the country to test its own principles, right? Is equality of opportunity important? Is equality of results more important than equality of opportunity? Let's have that discussion. Don't cancel, right? Don't diminish. Don't demonize. Don't make it personal. Let's have a competition of ideas. And I feel confident enough in the Constitution, its grounding principles, to say, if Kendi were here, look, you're entitled. You live in a great country that gives you the right to trash it in a way, to say that you think that it's all built on a house of cards. Okay, but let me give another side to that. And so I think that's how I try to approach all of these things, with respect and dignity, and let's let the arguments carry the day and let the people decide.
So we're going to get to questions here in a second, and Melissa, if you could actually jot a couple of those down for me, because I'm having some phone issues. I want to go back to the 1776 Unites work, because the group of people that you have pulled together, it's an amazing group of scholars and practitioners. Give us a little bit of insight into what that experience has been like, because you are working in a countercultural way, especially around these founding principles and how we understand the American founding. Tell us some of your experiences about how you are being perceived as an organization and the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah, we're at a very interesting time in our country. Obviously, there's, since the George Floyd murder a year ago, there's been a national reckoning on race, and you've almost had to choose a side. And especially if you're black, you really have to choose a side, right? Because there's a certain narrative. You're either part of the program or you're not, right? You're either down with the ideology or you're not. And if you're white, there's a lot of pressure also for you to be, you got to get that Black Lives Matter sign up in your yard, like, quickly, because you've got to signal that you are representing, that you have deep empathy for the plight of black people in this country, right? And, so the voices that are most prominent when it comes to things like issues of race are folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who, crafted the New York Times 1619 Project, or Ibram Kendi, or even Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility. Like there's an ideology. A lot of it is, I think, grounded in critical race theory, but critical theory in general would be critical gender theory. A lot of it is on this ideology of America is fundamentally a oppressive society. And it's racist, it's sexist, it's classist, it's just fundamentally, systemically at its core, an oppressive nation. And so if you disagree with that ideology and actually have the courage to say something like that, you run a pretty good risk of being vilified within your own community. And so, you know, again, Bob Woodson, 1776 Unites, got together a group of scholars and said, you know what, we disagree. It's not like you're a bad person, Nicole Hannah-Jones, or I don't know them at all. You know, I presume they are. You know, they have dreams and aspirations for their own children, and so they're human beings. We should respect them. They just have different ideas, right? And so we said we have a different idea, and here we've laid it out. Here's the evidence for why we think the country is not this permanently racist country that you describe, because here's the evidence that suggests maybe there's a different outcome. You know, when you look at black middle class wealth that has grown over the years and the factors that contribute to it, you're like, okay, maybe there are ingredients that black people in this country are following in order to be successful. And then you actually see a significant white poverty rate. And issues like, wait, maybe there are other issues that have nothing to do with race that determine economic success or not. Maybe there are practices around family structure, faith, education, entrepreneurship that affect everybody, right? And so we put those ideas forth. And I will say sometimes we get personally attacked and called all sorts of horrible names. But, you know, after a while you start to realize, maybe when they start calling you horrible names, that's actually an indication that they've lost the ability to focus on the argument, and you know you're winning. So you know what? You just gotta let that stuff slide off and just focus on, again, the competition of ideas. So, again, I think 1776 Unites, and by the way, one of, I think, many groups of different racial hues that are coming together to remind us all of the power of what has been built in this country, warts and all. Doesn't mean, again, that there aren't issues, but the Constitution, the amendments, the Declaration of Independence, those documents have embedded within them the tools of self-betterment, the tools of self-renewal, in the same way that we believe every human being has embedded within them the tools of self-betterment, the tools of self-renewal. And that's, you know, we're going to stand on that and see how far it gets us.
I wasn't going to go in this direction, but I think it is important, given some of the writing that you're doing. You have a book that's coming out.
I do have a book, thank you. It's called Agency, and it's coming out in January of 2022.
Well, we look forward to having you back here on campus for that. But you talk about the importance of faith as well. And obviously, if there's a part of a curriculum that's tough to integrate into public schools these days, one is certainly civics, rightly understood as we're discussing, but another is faith. So how, and here we are at a Christian university, how do we incorporate the importance of faith, especially as being citizens of a democratic republic? On Constitution Day, how do we think about that?
Yeah, well, some people think we are incorporating faith because wokeness has become its own religious ideology. It's a fair question. You know, for me, you obviously can't encourage a specific faith commitment within K-12 education, right? But you can educate young people in particular about the importance of having a faith commitment in your own life. You know, the Constitution and other documents in the United States, it's very interesting. It's all about, it's partly about public policy, but it's also about self-governance. It's a document that wants we, the people, to be self-governing, where the government plays its appropriate role, but for the most part, you are free. You are free as a human being. That's liberty. and freedom in our country. So the question is, if there is not this sort of overarching government institution to provide those guardrails, where is that moral direction coming from? And I would argue that it's coming from your family. I would also argue that it's coming from a faith commitment, education, and then, down the road, entrepreneurship and building wealth, a concept I call free: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. If you want to live in a free society, we need young people, the rising generation, to adopt an ideology around family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, where family is not the family that you're from, it's the family that you form. And the R in religion is about having a faith commitment. Doesn't matter if it's Buddhist, Christian, whatever, but that moral code has to come from somewhere. The Constitution was not written on the presumption that the government would be dictating all of the major decisions in your life. It actually was written in such a way that it actually wants to be hands-off. But that doesn't diminish the importance of having a moral code that you're living against, right? And so I think a faith commitment can play that role for a lot of Americans, especially young Americans who right now they're not benefiting from what a spiritual connection could be in their lives.
I want to get to some of the good questions that we have incoming. One is, and I think you've demonstrated it here, Ian, but how can I as a student help shift the culture of polarized politics and indifference, kind of the polar opposites in some ways, right? We're either hyper engaged and polarized, or we're apathetic, and I would argue that in some ways those can be connected, that some people look at a highly polarized age and just put their hands up and say, I don't want any part of that. How do you teach appropriate civil engagement on issues like this that have become so polarizing?
Yeah, and maybe there's a third variant of what you're talking about, which is that people who are silent, not because they're apathetic, but because they're terrified, right? Because they're like, wait a minute, whoa, I can't say that, because if I say that, my friends will red pill me or whatever the phrase is. But I'll be ostracized in some way, and honestly, a lot of it comes down to leadership at universities. I think you've got to create an environment where democratic discourse is encouraged. Where people who have the courage to speak their mind, especially informed opinion, even sometimes uninformed opinion. This is America, but you got to create. So we're launching a new network of international baccalaureate high schools in the Bronx next year in 2022, and it's all about equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity, and it's about democratic discourse. So we're literally, this morning I was with my co-founders, what's our canon? Will we actually have Ibram Kendi on our canon? Probably. We'll also have Thomas Sowell, right? I did a debate the other day with a professor at Bryn Mawr who's a professor at their School of Education who'd never even heard of Thomas Sowell.
Oh, jeez.
I'm like, what is going on? How's that possible? And she's an expert in critical race theory.
Yeah.
Like, how's that possible? At least have a full exposure to all ideologies before you come down so hard in one fashion. Like, that's criminal.
Yeah.
So part of it is leadership. Leadership has to set the environment so that people know what the guardrails are or not. And right now, I think it's leadership that's failing, honestly, on many campuses, many business leaders who are just allowing the loudest voices to control the dialogue, even though they know it's wrong. There was Paul Rossi, who was a teacher at a private school in New York. His school was going through a whole batter of woke ideology and curricula, and he had a meeting with his the head of the school, and he taped the conversation. So that may not be something you want to do, but he taped the conversation with the head of the school was saying, "I know, Paul, this is crazy, these ideas, this is nonsense." And meanwhile, he'll go out and say, no, any racial disparity must be due to structural racism. There is no other issue. Every kid is oppressed. America's a racist society. And he doesn't even believe it himself. And so leadership has to create the environment so that young people in particular know that they have the freedom to express their ideas, disagree agreeably, and then not demonize. I think that it's not always, you as a young person, you got to choose for yourself as well, but it's also the environments that you're placed in that help to cultivate a certain culture of discourse.
A question as well, and we've got time for a couple more, and I'll just read it as it's written. As a black man, how do you navigate being patriotic while also potentially being viewed as a traitor to your race or to more progressive racial reckoning agendas?
Be prepared that that's going to happen no matter what you do. It's just, there's some folks, for them, that's the weapon. That's the weapon that if I wield it, then I'll nix that person. And because they've got nothing else.
Right.
And so as long as you start to realize, like, okay, I've heard that one. Yeah, I've heard that one. Okay, great. So what about the non-marital birth rates within our community? Or what about other issues that have to do with the issues we're talking about? Or the successful black community? Are they all just LeBron James? Are they all just like random black people that have been successful? Or are there patterns of behavior that are not unique to a given race that can lead to success? So look, it's not easy, and believe me, I've run schools, so I have running schools in the heart of the South Bronx is not for the faint of heart. So I've developed a thick skin to some degree, but you have to start to realize a lot of these people throwing bombs, they've got nothing else. And I don't want to throw bombs back. I actually just want to get back to the issues. If we genuinely care about the rising generation, what is it that we can learn over the course of this country's amazing history that has worked and still doesn't work? In the heart of the South Bronx, the school system that I'm launching a network of schools, in 2015, the kids that started 9th grade 4 years later, only 2% graduated from high school ready for college, right? Meaning that they started 9th grade and either dropped out or did graduate with their diploma, but still couldn't do reading and math without remediation if they went to community college. That is a systemic barrier. It's not necessarily exclusively racist, but it has a disproportionately, quote-unquote, racist impact. So there are systemic problems that we all should rally around and change. But again, people are going to accuse you, and again, once you realize that that's all they've got, it's like, okay, what can I learn from that? Got it. Let's move on.
So two final questions. One for me, I think what's one of the arguments I try to make to our students who are obviously graduate policy students is that not only should they think about careers in policy on the administrative side, but they also think about running for office. This is something that you've done, and unlike me, you did it successfully. You actually won your race. But tell me, after decades of working on this as a founder and a practitioner, what prompted you to actually run for office for your local school board?
Oh my gosh, my own children. So, look, I'm here in Pepperdine. I live in New York. I travel across the country. I speak out on issues of opportunity and upward mobility. And then in my own hometown, our hometown did what's called an equity audit, and for our schools. And in this document, which I thought the conclusions were written even before the research was started, that it painted, in my view, our town as a racist town. I thought the research was badly done. I thought the data that was presented was very skewed. The population that had been interviewed was the narrow population. And all these things, I decided to write a critique of this equity audit. Just to share with, again, I wasn't demonizing anyone, just I wanted to share with my fellow neighbors that I got this document and I think it was really poorly done. And so I posted this on the Parents of Pelham Facebook page, and there's like 2,500, 3,000 people. And it got people talking about their concerns with the school system and other things that they were seeing that they thought directionally were a problem. And the reaction to that document then started to make it clear to me that leadership, the school board in this case, needed to have alternative voices because it didn't appear that they were really getting a diverse set of viewpoints when they were making decisions that affected our kids. So I decided to throw my hat in the ring, and I won. But it was brutal.
Yeah.
It was brutal. There were a lot of, it was brutal. Local politics, believe me. But again, equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity. I probably said those 6 words 500 times over the course of my campaign, because that's what I believe we should all be about. And, I won by a large margin, and I was very proud of that.
So a last question here that relates to not only your school board election, but also the work you're doing in launching these charter schools. As it relates to COVID, what do you think about the burgeoning school choice movement, education pods, and so forth? Do you think that there's a policy Overton window that is opening for school choice? And just maybe as a last piece, because this will be my last question, is there an opportunity, as there seems to be in what you're looking to launch next fall, for there to be a greater civics component in these charter schools that are launching?
I certainly hope so. The U.S. Census data just came out. Annually they ask parents, what type of schooling are you either involved in or interested in? And historically in the black community, only about 3.3% of parents reported interest in homeschooling. The latest census data says that number is 16.1%, which is really interesting.
5 times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's very interesting. And I think you'll see that across the board, that more and more parents are looking for completely different educational options. I mean, imagine if you are a parent in the district I just talked to you about, in the heart of the South Bronx, where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college. You think a 24-year-old single mom whose daughter is about to go into kindergarten wants that to be the future for her kid? So I hope there is a revolution, and I think I'm starting to gravitate towards this term parental choice in education versus school choice, just because there's so much baggage associated with the school choice, because framing actually matters.
Yep.
And it's about parental choice. I mean, I would imagine most of the young people in this room, whether it was a policy or a practice, your parents exercised school choice throughout the course of your life. They exercised parental choice in education, either by moving to a nice suburb or going to private school, however you got here. My guess, I don't know, but my guess is you benefited from having power of choice of what your parents thought would be best for you. So my hope is that one of the survivors of the COVID era is a recognition that parents deserve more. I mean, only a third of all kids in the United States pre-COVID were reading at proficiency levels based on the National Assessment for Educational Progress. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's kids of all races.
Yeah.
And so I think choice is part of the answer, and I hope that that is something that survives.
Please join me in thanking Ian Rowe for being with us today. Ian, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
It's been a real honor to have you, and for those of you joining us on live stream, thanks so much for joining us here. For all of you who've registered, we are going to be sending around a link with the video from today's conversation, and we hope that if you've enjoyed this conversation, you take that as an opportunity to send it around to your network. And as we often say, we see public policy differently from here, and I think we've certainly done that in this conversation. So Ian, thanks again, and thanks all for joining us.